Welcome everybody to today's interview. Whether or not you are a delegate at NetSpeed, I do hope this interview is going to be a fun one for you. My name is Lauren Sergy. I'm the communications strategist at the Alberta Library and the coordinator for the NetSpeed Libraries Technology Conference. And as a fun little pre-conference activity, I thought it'd be great to take an opportunity to get to know our keynote speakers a little bit better. And the speaker that I have with us today is Jessamyn West. On her website, librarian.net, Jessamyn humbly describes herself as a library technologist living in Vermont, which is a really succinct way of, I would say actually a slightly incomplete way, Madame Jessamyn, of saying everything that she does. Because in reality, Jessamyn is so much more than just a library technologist. She is a library legend, as far as I'm concerned. She's an advocate for libraries as public spaces, where people should be free to be who they are, find what's important to them, and share what they feel needs to be shared. She challenges tropes of librarianship and clearly articulates difficulties that our profession faces today. Now, we are so excited, Jessamyn, to have you as our opening keynote speaker at NetSpeed in October. But I want to make sure that we keep all of the keynote stuff fresh for our people. So we're not talking your keynote today. We're going to get into, hopefully, your head a little bit more. And I'm looking at helping our delegates and librarians out there of all stripes, helping them get an idea of who Jessamyn is in context of your professional work, your livelihood, and all of that. And with that in mind, I have to start off with a question that has been like in the back of my head ever since I hunted you down. And that is that on your Jessamyn.com site, and by the way, for those of you who aren't familiar with Jessamyn, she's got like 5 different websites and they're all amazing. You describe yourself as librarian, writer, technologist, justice of the peace, and moss enthusiast. Explain the moss enthusiast thing.
Well, I spend a lot of time on the internet, like a lot of people, and especially people in rural areas who may be night owls where everybody in town goes to bed at 8 or 9 o'clock. So I decided I needed, at some point, maybe, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago, an offline hobby, like a thing you do that's not typing or reading or Skyping or whatever.
Those exist?
I've always, sorry?
Those exist?
A couple of them, right? But I think with librarianship, a lot of times it's, there's a lot of people who knit, there's a lot of people who have pets, there's a lot of people who are serious cooks, there's a lot of people who, you know, are hiking or fishing or whatever. And my father was always really into bonsais when I was a kid. So, you know, little tiny plants, and you kind of fuss with them all the time and buy little stuff for them and whatever. But the part of the bonsais that I always liked was the green sort of grass stuff that grew on the bottom of them, moss. And
okay.
One of the things about moss that's cool is you can basically get it from the woods, and I live in the woods, and you can stick it in a jar and do a couple, you know, small things with it, and it just stays looking nice forever, and you don't have to do much to it. Like, I travel a lot, even though I love Vermont, so I'm in and out a lot, so I can't sort of have a pet all the time. I'm not a good knitter. I'm not good at counting. My left hand doesn't do anything. I can't, I'm not good at playing an instrument. Yeah. But having a little fussy green thing in my house that you can sort of neglect, but also sort of pay attention to, solves a problem for me. And I feel like I got in a little bit before the sort of moss bandwagon, because now you walk around Brooklyn and everybody's got a little terrarium, a little moss terrarium in their front window, and they're like, la-di-da, but there's not that much you have to do with them, and so I can have greenery in my house year round.
Cool.
So a hobby that
challenging tropes.
Yeah.
Instead of the cat, you went for the moss.
Now, my sister has cats. You know, everybody else I know has cats. I'm a very happy cat auntie, but yeah. Exactly. A cat would be miserable here without me too often.
They occasionally need interaction and food, whereas moss is slightly more accommodating of your schedule.
A lot more accommodating.
Excellent. Well, mystery solved. I'm very happy about this, actually.
Read more at mossarium.com I think. I made a little website that shows you how to make them, because of course, how could I be a librarian if I didn't share every single thing I knew?
I love your diversity of websites. I really, really do. It's hilarious and it's enlightening and it's interesting. It's so interesting, everything that you've gotten into. And along those lines, I would love to know a little bit about your background. Like, what led you to librarianship in the first place? And what did those formative, first kind of 10 years of your career look like?
Well, I grew up in a rural town in Massachusetts, and I live in a town that's about the same size in Randolph. And my mom was always really into just kind of civics, which is like less of a big deal in Canada because I feel like everybody's into civics. But in America, there's like a lot of people who are not into civics at all, like that whole sort of community idea. And in my small town, there were a couple sort of public institutions, and one of them was a library. So I'm one of those people who had good library experiences early on and was kind of a bookish, nerdy kid. I went to college in Massachusetts, and kind of an alternative college where do what you want kind of thing. And I was really into language, into linguistics, into writing, that kind of thing. But I graduated being like, what am I, be a language scientist? I don't know how that works. I didn't have a plan. So I moved to Seattle like you did in 1990 and lived there and got more interested in sort of social justice types of things. I've always been what I would consider an activist, just helping people solve problems, social problems, personal problems, whatever. And so at the time, I thought I wanted to go to law school in order to do that. And kind of looked around. University of Washington was near me, but I didn't get in because hippie school, my transcript was just a pile of evaluations. Jessamyn's kind of smart and interesting, but what you need is like grades.
Well, yeah.
So I didn't get into law school, and I was like, well, that sounds kind of like a profession where you have to kind of dress up and get up early, which isn't me.
Suits are required.
Yeah, and I was like, well, what else is around? And a lot of people sort of, when you're looking at these things, tell you to kind of think of what you actually enjoy doing. And when I was in college, one of the things I really liked doing was just fussing around in the library, looking things up, figuring things out, solving problems, putting information together. And University of Washington, which I lived up the street from, had a really good library school. And I was like a lot of people at the time, I was like, library school's a thing? I had no idea. And not only is it a thing, but University of Washington had a pretty good school. I mean, now they have a very good school. It's the iSchool. It's fancy. When I went there, it was the library school. And I went to school there. And what I found, which pleased me to no end, was that my sort of social justice work and my helping people work and my librarianship work could all fit together, that I didn't need to do like my job during the day and then my, I help people stuff at night, that I could do a lot of work teaching people how to use things. I took a lot of like librarianship for special needs populations. I did a big project on prison libraries. I did a lot of bibliographies on feminism and activism and that kind of thing. So I was like, wow, this is awesome. Like I had no idea about the freedom to read. I had no idea about children's rights to read, that libraries support that. They don't just do it by accident. They do it on purpose. So I was really excited about that.
You have a name.
Yeah. And so I went to school. I started in 1993. And I graduated in 1996. And for those of you who are kind of putting that on a tech continuum, it's like text, internet. I don't know if this is reversing or not, but starting with text, internet, and then ending with the graphical web. And so it was a really interesting time to be in library school because we were learning about the web when the web was just becoming the web, which was a great time for being in a sort of a cohort of like-minded people, a community of practice of people who are excited and learning about the same thing. So when I got out of library school, I was in Seattle in the 90s, which for people who are, of a certain age are like, that was the little tech center, one of the little tech centers.
Yeah.
So I did a combination of like working at Seattle Public Library, doing basic technology instruction, which I still do to this day, teaching people how to use computers. But also I worked for an internet service provider, helping people get DSL installed. So I learned a lot of the computer aspect of information delivery in addition to the sort of human and library side of information delivery. And the funny thing was, at the time, you know, I'm teaching people how to use email in 1996, 97, 98, and I just figured, I'll do this for a couple of years, and then everybody will get email. And then we can deal with really complicated stuff like how to keep your stuff private on the internet and how to, you know, sophisticated level 202, 303 stuff, good web design, whatever, user experience. No, we're still at the everybody's getting an email address. And it turns out I still really like doing that. But that's what got me really interested in digital divide issues.
Yeah.
Because why doesn't everyone have an email address? And I don't mean sort of millennial types who are like, well, I'm kind of post-email. I'm talking about people who need an email address and don't have one.
Yeah.
And why is that? What feeds into that? So I'll stop here so I don't give away precious keynote information. But that really got me interested.
Yeah. Why is this a thing?
Because it's not just a technological problem anymore, right? It's, you know, an email address is free. You can get to a computer at almost any public library, even though it's not the same as having one at home. What's keeping people from doing this, and how do we help them do this, basically? And that's kind of what my last several decades have been, kind of untangling that problem and living in Vermont and making little moss gardens and just getting really into sort of public library civics. I'm really active in the Vermont Library Association. And we have a lot of librarians who I think have those same issues within their personal lives, in addition to trying to help the people in their communities answer those questions for themselves. And it's tricky and interesting.
Yeah, and of course, you know, as despite advances in technology, obviously, since the 90s, I mean, you were really in on the ground level there, which is so exciting. There's still so much going on in that sphere that's developing, and that the problems can still in many ways be so similar.
Exactly.
They were back then, you know, same problems, slightly different tech.
Well, and I feel like the underpinning reasoning, you know, late global capitalism, like, are the same, but figuring out how they impact the people that we serve and how to just effectively deal with it. Like, it's easy to sit at home and be like, Microsoft, they suck, and that's why we have a problem. But it's overly simplistic, it's not accurate, and it almost removes you from the responsibility of having to deal with the fact that that's true. You know, like any endemic social problem, like institutionalized racism, like institutionalized poverty, like homophobia that we deal with. Like, the underpinnings are important to think about, but realistically, the boots on the ground way we actually address this with the people we serve are the kind of tricky and interesting librarian issues that are worth sort of working on proactively, because you might be able to think forever about how to solve hunger, but there's hungry people today, and you need to handle that at the same time.
Yeah, and of course, if what we do is hang around and, you know, blame big corporation and money hungry this and that, we're also shifting all of the responsibility to fix it on them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all in favor of like placing responsibility where it needs to be, but as well, figuring out how to fix the problem, it takes all of us. You know, I mean, that's my sort of civics thing. Like, everybody needs to pitch in to help. Libraries can often be a focusing point for where that help should come from.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, obviously our audience here is mostly people working within the library profession. There might be some people watching this interview who are just getting started on their library careers. And that idea of working in the profession today is something that you talk about quite a bit and very openly on your blog. One of the, and by blog, I'm going to specify the librarian.net blog in this case. And on librarian.net, there's a bit that you do every now and then that I find so interesting, and it's your work and money report.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I find that absolutely fascinating, because working in librarianship today, you know, we're strongly affected by this gig market economy and this notion that we have to have multiple income streams coming in because our jobs just aren't stable. You know, libraries aren't a bastion of, they're not a warm, cuddly blanket that we can wrap ourselves in for 30 years until we can start collecting our pension. So you break down everywhere that you've been working and all of your different income streams in this work and money report. It's very open. It's very honest. What prompted you to start sharing this information so openly on your blog?
Well, it's a couple things. I mean, number one, I'm like a quantified self nerd, right? Like I keep a list of all the books I've read, a list of all the movies I've seen, a list of every single place I stayed every year. And I enjoy that to kind of look back and kind of keep track of myself, you know, because it's interesting to me. Am I out of town more this year than last year? What about 10 years ago? But the money thing, I think, is especially tricky because I assume this is the same in Canada, but in America, like it's a big, like people are really weird talking about money.
Yeah, we don't talk money.
Either they talk too much about it or they don't talk enough about it. And so I think there's a lot of people who wind up with kind of money problems, issues, questions. And they think maybe other people have it all figured out, but maybe they don't. Librarianship historically doesn't pay very well. Librarianship historically is a profession that's overarchingly female until you get up to management where it balances out a little bit, but overarchingly female. Women are known for getting paid less for various social reasons, but you know, some of them are women tend to not negotiate as aggressively. I mean, there's other problems. I don't mean to place it solely in the laps of women, but they tend maybe not to negotiate aggressively. So you go in for a job and they're like, it pays this. And you're like, okay. Like, I like money. And I do feel like for a lot of people, especially younger librarians, again, like gig economy stuff, you know, maybe you don't want a one full-time job at one library, or maybe you can't get one full-time job at one library, or maybe you want to travel, or maybe whatever else. There are a lot of different places to get money from theoretically, and it's also important. I feel like it's also partly sort of a privilege report. Like one of the main things that made me able to be the librarian that I am right now is that grad school was cheap, and that isn't true anymore. You know, I'll tell people like, oh, go to University of Washington, in-state tuition, and people are like, do you know what that costs now? But it was a thing you could pay for with a pizza job, you know, when I went. And so that puts me in a very specific position of privilege. And I feel like investigating privilege is always something we should be mindful of doing, but that sort of helps. But the other thing is letting people know where money can come from. So, you know, I do some writing for Computers and Libraries magazine. It pays really well compared to like writing for a blog about a thing, which pays, all the blogs tend to pay terribly. I'm going to be doing some work with Wikipedia promoting their One Lib, One Ref program, which I love. And like, I would do anyhow, but they're like, how about some money for that? And I was like, oh, that would be nice. And talking to librarians about other ways that they can look at their own life of work and money can also help, I feel like helps us reflect back into our communities other ways of looking at that. And I feel like it opens a conversation. And the other thing is, just the basic answer is I'll tell people like, oh, I'm a librarian in rural Vermont. And they'll be like, oh, what's your library? And I'm like, well, because
a little more complicated than that.
I feel like I need to say is I don't actually work at the public library in my town, or rather I do, I fill in there because I live a quarter mile up the street. And if someone's sick, they call me, but I don't have like a one library, one librarian relationship to the field of librarianship. And I also feel like for a lot of consultants, because a lot of what I do is, I technically could be called consulting, but like maybe that's not even their job. Like, you know what I mean? Like maybe they have family money, or maybe they have a different job. And I always feel like the conversation of like, how do you make ends meet is useful if you can have that conversation without it becoming like a weird statusing conversation. And you can use it to achieve more clarity of how people do what they do. And like I said, I'm in a lucky kind of privileged position. And I feel like being able to openly share stuff that other people might not be able to can help other people sort of figure this out. Plus, I want to sort of normalize the idea of being a librarian without a library, because lots of us do it. But sometimes people are like, well, how does that work? Where does your money, do you know, like people think I have a secret job. And I'm like, no, I just have a lot of weird half-ass jobs, but not a lot of grad school debt and a whole bunch of other things. And that's how it comes together.
Right. So looking at these reports, I'm sure that there's some people out there who might say, oh, yeah, so she gets to write for computers and libraries, or she gets to do this and she does the consulting and the speaking, but she's Jessamyn West, right? This work magically comes to her somehow. You weren't always who you are today. And part of being able to bring in these additional gigs and these additional revenue streams, and, in many ways being a librarian without a specific library, is part of building up your resume and your career. So in terms of building up your personal brand, to use a hot overused buzzword, it's a useful one.
I do say it though, and then I laugh.
And you're like, oh, I had to with some of these. Can't believe that came out of my mouth. But in terms of building up your personal brand, that is a very important aspect for many of our careers now. So how did you do that and kind of establish yourself as a thought leader within libraries?
Well, I think one of the things, and it's hard, right? Because you say like thought leader within libraries. I'm like, that's not me. But like, I know other people say it. So I also don't want to be like weirdly fake modest about it.
Yeah. Own it. You've worked for it.
I think there's a couple things that all go together. Number one, my father was a technologist, and a briefly well-known one. He was a character in a book that became briefly popular. And so in the early 80s, he was like a famous guy. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I remember growing up was listening to him on the phone talk about the things. And he talked to reporters a lot. And I feel like through osmosis, I sort of learned how to do that, like what they want to hear, what they don't want to hear, how you have those conversations, how you work sound bites out and get them into what you want to say. Part of it is getting into the internet early. Like I said, I was in library school early. I have a name that's unique. Mm-hmm. I got the Jessamyn.com domain for my 28th birthday or something like that.
Best birthday present ever.
Yeah, thanks, Dad. Right. Yeah. But part of it, again, having a dad who's a technologist who made me grow up feeling like not only computers were normal, which I feel like was helpful, but also that like talking to people about computers and that you're a person who might have something to say. Again, it's a privilege thing. Like I grew up feeling like people wanted to know what I had to say. And as a result, I didn't have to spend a lot of time thinking about like, should they be talking to someone else? Mm-hmm. I spend more time now trying to direct sort of inquiries. Sometimes I'm the person, but a lot of times I'm like, you should really be speaking to people of color. You should really ask the disability activists about the ADA aspect of this library issue. And so it's a combination of me feeling okay talking about myself, but also having a Rolodex now of other people that I can sort of direct that kind of query to. Like there's so many librarians who I feel like are just genius, interesting people who kind of don't, either they're busy having a job, which takes a lot of time, and you don't necessarily get to kind of BS with reporters for 20 minutes or 30 minutes, but also I'm trying to think of, but also they're just not sort of extroverted, blobbity blah people, that I have a tendency, I don't mind listening to myself talk. I'll get off a conversation and be like, oh God, I should have said that differently. Or I see myself misquoted in the media and I'm like, I should stop talking to reporters. But by and large, not only does the stuff work, but I hear from other people, hey, that did a good job of representing the thing. Like lately, I've been involved in sort of online discussions about Hispanic librarian who stepped down from his job because he felt like he was getting a whole bunch of like crappy racial pressure from the people he worked with. And it was just a bad story, but he was feeling okay about it. I'm like, oh, if you talk to Reforma, like the Spanish speaking librarian organization, he's like, oh, well, no, I don't. Like I asked somebody once, and I was like, oh, well, let me just go get them for you, and spend a little time kind of cross-pollinating with people who may not feel like reaching out is either for them, or maybe they tried and it didn't work, or whatever the thing was. But then also on the back channel, I hear from people who are like, you know, thanks for helping that guy out with that. Thanks for being a good ally.
Yeah.
Because it's a little too easy to just be like, well, listen to what Jessamyn has to say. I'm the voice of everybody, which is awkward. And I don't want to be that person. But
Right.
try to figure out when it's appropriate to step up and say, libraries feel this way, and I'm one person among many who can represent.
Yeah.
Or be like, well, I can't represent, but here's some other people who you should talk to. And again, like finding where your privilege is and how that needs to be relevant, because I am still female. I do still get guys talking over me at meetings all the time. Like I worked at the Internet Archive and I felt like the secretary for our group, because everybody there would be like, hey, take notes. And after a while, I'm like, nope. And you shouldn't even ask. But like, that's awkward. But having a little bit of status can help you sort of achieve more. And I feel like it kind of floats the boat of the whole profession. Like everybody, if you have more people who can speak eloquently for libraries, everybody in librarianship benefits. I don't feel like I'm one of those like, to the barricades, everybody needs a makerspace, fight me. Which I feel like, even though that's fine, like you're welcome to your opinion, most of the opinions I have are about public spaces and civics, and they're not controversial for the most part.
Right.
I don't get out in front of like, should we have Nazis speaking at the library? Although I have opinions, partly because people do look to me as like a voice for things, and I try to sort of spend that social capital usefully and not kind of flash of the pan political hate machine stuff that's going on nowadays.
Yeah. So part of this is very much about knowing the sphere in which you step into your role as an expert, as someone who's extremely knowledgeable, who talks about this. In your case, looking at libraries in terms of the public sphere and policy and all of that sort of stuff. And when a question does come your way, where there is someone with the different perspective or the better perspective, you pass it on to them. And that's actually a very generous move, because some people do feel that, oh, if I can't answer a question, then what right do I have to speak about any of this? But also in terms of ensuring that you're the person who knows about this, will help direct attention to you where it's really, really warranted. And that helps build you up in that area, I would think.
Well, and I also feel like, you know, I do a lot of public speaking, coming to NetSpeed. I'm speaking at the Wisconsin Library Association conference, that kind of thing. And I love what I do. It's super fun. But I also do feel like for a lot of these organizations, they also probably have local people who, if they're not going to be keynoting the conference, should at least be coming to and speaking at the conferences. Yeah. And I try to sort of encourage people to sort of, if they like that kind of thing, even just attending, but they're like, oh, I have some ideas, to sort of tell their stories. I always, like when I speak at a conference, I stay at the conference, I sit in on tons of programs at the conference. I learn about libraries the same way I hope I teach people certain things about libraries. Mm-hmm. And part of what I think is useful is encouraging more people, more different kinds of voices, like a more diverse set of voices, certainly. And just more people doing more kind of the non-sexy work of librarianship. But like, you know, I sat in on this great program at, I think it was the Ontario Library Association, of like, here's how we do our sort of special needs population drop-in time program. And a lot of it was like, how do you buy snacks? What's a good program? How do people get transportation? Like just nuts and bolts and nuts and bolts. But every librarian who sat in there was like taking notes, like it was going to help them serve their population. And, you know, librarianship as a profession we work in our buildings for the most part. I mean, we're working on it, social media, et cetera, et cetera. But the more we have excuses and experiences to get together, whether that's in person, whether it's through social media, whether it's, you know, who even knows, the more I feel like we can serve our people better. And so, you know, the other thing that I do in sort of addition to this is one of my big work and money job things was I worked at Metafilter, a huge online community blog, as a moderator, sort of a director of operations, and teaching people or helping facilitate them having conversations online. I also feel like helps more people get information back and forth to each other during the times when they can't hang out together, right? Like I used to just spend a lot of time on the internet because I'm the only person awake in my town at 11 o'clock at night. But learning that there's actually a lot of people who are online who can cross-pollinate, who can give each other ideas, who can learn from each other. You know, I spend some time on Facebook every day, like an ALA think tank, which is kind of like a combination of like corner bar and professional development and everybody yelling at each other about Nazis or whatever it is. But you can meet other librarians. You can find people who are like you. You can ask questions about your thing, whether it's your personal stuff. You got a weird patron situation. You've got an extra legal situation and your lawyer said this, but you're not really sure about that. And that all helps us do what we want to do, which is serve our populations as effectively and compassionately as possible. But the more different kinds of people that you can interact with to help you do that, I feel like the better you are. I mean, we have 3 librarians at my public library in my town in Vermont. They've all been there for over 10 years. They're amazing. But I'm happy that they have professional development opportunities to talk to other librarians at the Vermont Library Association conference, etc., because it's too easy for 3 people running one institution to be like, we got it all taken care of. And they don't. Like, they always learn, they always grow, they always try to improve. But it's tricky. Not all libraries can say that. And so I feel like having people who are sort of vocal, but also kind of friendly, you know, instead of like, you're not being the right kind of librarian, to be like, there's a lot of different kinds of librarians. Let's learn about them, you know, because nobody wants to be confronted by a consultant telling them they're doing it wrong. Everyone hates that.
Yeah,
So
that's very true. And like you said, there's so many different kind of librarians. And that leads really beautifully into a question that I had for you, because you're a really fierce protector of what libraries are and what librarianship is. But it can feel as like librarianship, I honestly don't even know what it is anymore. You know, and there's this saw of the new grad, a couple, like 3 years after they enter the workforce, they're saying, I didn't realize I went to library school to be doing this. And realistically, in much of our work, especially in the individual public libraries, we need to be jacks of all trades. And we end up being everything from tech support to de facto social workers and things that don't necessarily tweak even the librarians themselves as being at the core of librarianship. So what do you think being a librarian means today, and how can we preserve that notion of librarianship in these places when we don't always feel like that's what we're engaging in a day-to-day basis?
Well, I think that's really challenging, and it also kind of goes back to the fact that libraries have a tendency to be kind of hyper-local. So, you know, my library in town offers completely different services than my next library in the next town, or the library over the mountain in the next town. And part of that is because they serve their community. Part of it is because of the people who work there. But part of it is also that they're just teeny, and so they can be super flexible. And so like, if people ask, you know, what does it mean to be a librarian as opposed to any other kind of like information worker, knowledge worker, tech, whatever. And I'm like, you know, a librarian uses sort of the tools that they have available, information resources to help people solve their problems. And
that's a nice broad definition, actually. I really like that.
Well, and the difference between the librarian approach to doing that and I think lots of other people who have jobs doing similar things is, and I'm really heavy into publics. I know academic libraries have a slightly different mission, special libraries, slightly different mission, et cetera, et cetera. But for publics especially, the big deal is you give them sort of the best information the most efficiently in the way that they need it.
Yeah.
And so the big deal with that is, you know, libraries aren't trying to sell you something. And that makes us not Apple. That makes us not Google. That makes us not LinkedIn. That makes us not Facebook. And there's good things about Google and Apple and LinkedIn and Facebook, but they have something to sell. Or you're the customer and they're selling you to somebody else. You know, Equifax has been my week this week.
Yeah.
And so given that, it really does belong to the people in this way that other institutions don't. The spaces are public in ways that other spaces are not. And the people who work there are service professionals, for the most part, in ways that other types of employees aren't. And I say that kind of not to be exclusionary, but to be kind of inclusive, that my dream vision is the library serves every single person. And like, you move to town, and if you register to vote, you also get a library card. Like, why not? I don't understand why we don't do that, but whatever. But the thing that's so funky about them is that they're run by citizens for the most part. I mean, Canada has a little bit more of a kind of sort of overarching top-down government that does help kind of run the library infrastructure, but for the most part, the local, I mean, like, you guys have like a National Library and Archives that's like a real National Library and Archives, like, that has trickle-down effects to individual libraries in a way that I feel like our Library of Congress, as much as I love them, is different. Like,
but it's funny because more librarians here understand the Library of Congress.
I spend a lot of time looking at like the National Archives and the National Library Canada website being like, why don't we have this? Why don't we, I want this. Like, I mean, Library of Congress is doing a lot better than they were under James Billington, but it's just such a slog, you know what I mean? And so for me, it's the combination of service plus civics plus your information need, whatever you want, like patron focused. And then sort of there's a technology layer on top of it that influences and affects everything that we do, but they're just tools. You know, we're just the conduit for the tools. Like Apple did their ridiculous kickoff. I don't even know what it's called, but it ruined my Twitter for 24 solid hours. But Apple's like, we want to be the town square for the world. And I'm like, you don't even have a town square. Like, I have a town square in my town, and half the town square is like everybody hanging out, and that's awesome. But then the other half of it is kids trying to, like, you know, sneak around and like smoke cigarettes when they're not supposed to, and like hobos sleeping places, and like, you know, pissing in the bushes. And like, those things need to be managed. You can't just like run a store and
it's not shiny and clean and chrome outlined, right?
Right. I mean, the only way you get to have a store is because you overcharge people for technology, and then you have extra money to underpay people to clean your bathrooms. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, irritates me. And they're trying to appropriate the language of civics for the business of capitalism. And so I spent a little bit of time on Twitter being like, let's talk about what a town hall really is. Let's talk about how a small town really operates, because they know enough that those things are appealing that they try to sort of co-opt the language, but without having we're actually accessible to everybody. We're actually open to everybody. Like, this actually belongs to you. In the same way, it's like, whatever, there's the Americans with Disabilities Act in the United States, where at least the Apple Store has to be as accessible as the public library. But, you know, it doesn't mean that they have to make phones that necessarily work for people with shaky hands. They tend to work pretty well for people with visual disabilities, which is awesome. But that's only because you can sell them. You know what I mean? Not because it's your mission. And the last thing on that topic I wanted to talk about was, there's also the idea of making sure your library is like setting expectations about what they actually can do realistically with the money, time, and staff they have available. And also sometimes setting boundaries, which is like language I learned in my sort of online community world, but that I think I try to bring to the library world. Because just because somebody wants something from your library, it doesn't mean it's something the library has to offer. And so figuring out how to boundary what you actually provide, I feel like is a kindness you can provide to your community. But sometimes people in the community are like, I don't like it when people say no. And then you have to figure out where you go from that. Like, maybe the community wants something you don't want to provide and you're wrong. Work on it. But maybe the community wants, you know, 24/7 access to the library, and you need to explain to them how the budget would change if you did that and why that's not going to happen. But hey, let's raise more money and talk about it. Like, it's sort of an ongoing conversation. But you do see a lot of, you know, kind of line workers, like people who are frontline librarians, stuck between poor boundary setting by management or administration and or unrealistic expectations by either patrons or management. So there's a lot of talk about how, what the hell's going on in libraries? I don't understand it, but I feel like it's more of a sort of communications and understanding issue than it is, we don't know what libraries are. If
Right.
that makes sense.
No, that does make sense. And we're going to start wrapping up, but I do have two more questions that I want to ask. And the first one is tied in to what you just said about the frontline workers and the establishment of boundaries and those sorts of issues. What do you see being the biggest human resource or employment issue libraries are facing right now?
Well, I don't know if this is the same in Canada, but I know it's the same. I know it's a big deal in the United States, but like, our libraries aren't as diverse as the populations they serve. Mm-hmm. I think that, I mean, there are lots of issues. And I don't mean to sort of poo-poo any of the other ones.
Oh no, the question isn't to the exclusion of other problems.
Yeah.
Sticking out in your mind.
The biggest deal is you look at who's working in libraries and you look at who's going to libraries, and their makeup is racially different, gender, different, sexual preference different. I mean, my words are terrible here, but the librarians, the people who are working in libraries are not reflecting the populations they serve. The Association for Research Libraries in the United States just came out with a paper this week, super interesting, just looking at research libraries and whether or not they felt like their personal feelings about whether they were as diverse as the populations they served and whether or not it mattered. Yeah. And, a lot of libraries were like, well, we're not quite as diverse as the populations we serve, but we think we're doing okay anyhow, sort of. I mean, I think there's lots of librarians who feel like if they're trying, that's kind of good enough. Mm-hmm. I don't mean to put down trying, because trying's important, but I also do feel like, if you're a person of color, if you're Muslim, if you're transgender, you want to be able to walk into a library and see not just books that reflect who you are, but people who reflect who you are as professionals, as people who do this. And there's a lot of reasons why that's not the case. But I do think one of the struggles we're going to have, I mean, in the United States at least, especially, which is what I've studied, is if librarians and libraries are seen as kind of old, fusty white ladies telling you no, that's going to be kind of, I think we say it's optics. Bad optics. Yeah. And we should be working on that. And one of the reasons the things that we've been trying aren't helping, according to this ARL report, is for a lot of people, you used to be able to kind of work your way up the food chain. You get an entry-level job, which were often, more likely you'd be able to get sort of more people in who hadn't been pipelined through library school, and then you work your way up. And a lot of those sort of support staff jobs just they're just going away completely, or they're being outsourced to other companies. And so a lot of the stepping stones that would scaffold you into a professional position where you'd be a person of color manager after 10 years or whatever are just going away. So the routes in are more difficult. Yeah. And so I just think, I think that's part of why we're seeing like some of the weird politics we're seeing in America is people are really getting confused about who the populations are we're serving and what our makeup should be. And it's complicated for me because it means kind of less people like me. Mm-hmm. But if the population doesn't look like me, that's actually what I should want. I mean, and I live in Vermont, so the population looks pretty much exactly like me. But in a lot of other places, it doesn't, it shouldn't. And we need to get results, not just kind of working on it, is my feeling. I mean, and that comes along with a whole bunch of other pay issues, equity issues, inclusion issues generally. But to me, that's the biggest one, that if we kind of don't do something about it, it's going to be bad for our profession in kind of general, difficult ways, not just real specific, like ebooks, what can you do? Like, we'll work on that.
Yeah. So the final question, and this kind of ties it back to technology pieces. So of course, NetSpeed is a technology conference. What do you see as the biggest tech issue that the public libraries are facing right now?
I think for me, the biggest deal is the kind of people talk a lot about like the singularity, right? In the future when like we upload our brains to the internet and everybody kind of knows everything and you just,
yeah,
right, the port behind your ear and suddenly you know every language. It's amazing. But I feel like one of the things that's getting in the way of the singularity, which I don't necessarily see as the sort of amazing utopia that everybody thinks it's going to be, is the fact that, brand differentiation is still a thing, which is fine, right? In order for the singularity to happen, like Apple and Google need to make nice. And in order for that to happen, the economic structure of the world needs to be completely different, right? And I have no faith that the government is going to be the one that's actually going to make that work.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that we used to sort of feel like, oh, maybe like all the brands will come together and they'll just be one phone and it'll be amazing. But I feel like the concern is going to be that what there's going to be is just like one giant kind of crappy database of stuff. And it's going to be run by, huge global mega corporations, not really for our benefit. And so from a library perspective, I feel like the concern is the shift from the library owning content. You buy a book, you have it, you do whatever the hell you want with it, period. That's the law in our country. It's a little different in Canada, but it's not a lot different.
Not really.
But like you have an ebook, you lease it, somebody needs to be taught how to use it. Maybe they update it and you didn't want them to. There's like a whole bunch of different file types. Everybody's fighting. I haven't even used the A word, like Amazon and their craziness. Now they own Whole Foods, which is, and kale is on sale all of a sudden and I'm supposed to be
that is happening.
But I feel like a lot of the container content kind of stuff and the leasing versus owning type of stuff for just the move to digital content generally, which again, in general is awesome. In specific is really tricky because it means we're going from a format that kind of doesn't require a manual to creating a layer of interface between people and their content, which again, not a huge issue, but what it means is we're a lot more beholden to companies to do the right thing, and they don't, which is why most of our, library software is terrible, and why we've got this weird relationship with vendors, right? Where there is a lot of good software out there, but a lot of times at the rates libraries can pay, we don't get the good stuff. You know what I mean? And so figuring out how to make that work, as well as dealing with like digital content where like, in Vermont, we lease a lot of databases at the state level. Yep. But like in other states, they don't. And you might have like two libraries that are 50 miles away from each other that are each paying for like a Ancestry.com subscription. That's weird. But, from Ancestry's perspective, they deserve to make a buck off it. Selling to libraries is pretty tricky for them. How do they work that out? And so figuring ways to sort of equitably get people access to content that's fair to businesses because they need to stay in business, and fair to libraries and the patrons that they serve, I feel like is one of the sort of big questions. And right now it's like a whole job in librarianship, electronic resources management. All you do is manage like this gigantic spreadsheet of garbage because we don't have simple and easy ways to navigate and negotiate digital content. Electronic resources librarians are amazing. So I don't mean to be like, all you do is deal with spreadsheets.
It's not a slam against the librarians doing
like those jobs are so hard, but it would be great if those people could do things that used more of their human brain and less that were just negotiating crappy contracts because this whole thing is sort of up in the air. So figuring out what to do with digital content, which has nothing to do with my talk, which is all about like people who don't know how to deal with digital content and how do we deal with them, but that's a whole other issue. I think is going to take up a lot of time for librarians in the next 5 or 10 years.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Jessamyn. And what you just said about dealing with that digital content, I can guarantee you that there's going to be people at NetSpeed, some people from my group, from the Alberta Library, who are going to want to talk your ear off.
Well, I will be around after the keynote.
Yes, we've got that open session after the keynote, which I'm really looking forward to. So Thank you again so much, Jessamyn, for carving out a chunk of time during the day to do this interview with us. Thank you to everybody who's already registered for NetSpeed. If you haven't registered for NetSpeed yet, time is running out. You've only got about a week or so left to do so. And for those of you who aren't able to attend, I hope you enjoyed this interview. It's a pleasure being able to bring Jessamyn to you to have this great conversation with her. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you so much, Jessamyn. You have a great day.
Thank you. You too.